All right, it looks like there's a ton of people in here now, so we will go ahead and get started. All right, and was everyone able, can I have a thumbs up if y'all were able to access the deck? And as you're opening the deck, I had a conversation in class last week with a young woman. I believe she was based in New Orleans. And something that the traditional route, whether you go to undergrad or you do a master's program, whatever it may be, something that I want to acknowledge is that the traditional journey does not necessarily include, and I believe that most designers of African descent, Black designers, does not include the conversation that we're having in our class. And that's been one of the biggest gaps is we as a people are typically not, we're leading in a lot of these areas, but we're not at the forefront of the conversation as to how we are so intrinsically intertwined in a space. And to simplify that, the design within the African diaspora should be a top priority when we talk about design, and it is not, which is my intention in the work that we're doing here. Okay, it looks like everyone has been able to access the deck, and we're in here. So I'm going to jump right in. We are talking about materiality, texture, and the language of space. So as you recall, and for anyone who is just starting with us and you're in class 3 for the first time, this is class 3. We've had 2 prior, and next week is going to be our last class. During class 1, we talked about how to establish interior identity and what does that mean. And now we've kind of broken off into the spokes of, okay, let's dive into color theory across the diaspora. And that was last week's course, which was week 2. And now here in week 3, we are kind of honing in on and touching on the idea of materiality, texture, and the language of space. And I think something that we're all very familiar with is textures that come to mind when we think about the textures across the African diaspora. And if you can all just kind of take a second, what's one material that you think of that reminds you of us as a culture? If anything comes straight to mind, please type it in the chat. Because I know that we all are kind of intertwined in that way where we all think of something that is wood. Yes, we all think of something that feels very red clay. We all think of something that's very tied to us as a culture. So this is what we're touching on today. Now that you're in the deck, okay, what is materiality? Yes, thank you for dropping that in the chat here. Materiality refers to the physical materials being used. So what you're typing in the chat right now, but that's fabrics, furniture, natural elements, and architectural finishes. And how they carry across the cultural, historical, and innovative significance across the diaspora. So when we talk about materiality in the space, it does take form for us in our physical space in many different ways. And those are the points that I just touched on above. It's not just about what something is made of. So when we think about wood, it's not just about the fact that something is made of wood, but how those materials communicate identity, resilience, and heritage. So we can take a faux wood, for example, and that can be something that feels like it's replicated of wood that is familiar to us, but it doesn't necessarily have the identity, resilience, and heritage tied to that piece. So materiality for us, as it reflects our culture, it often is cultural legacy, right? So woven textiles like the kente and mudcloth. When we think about colonial disruption and reclamation, last week we touched on color reclamation. So in the color theory, we've kind of been sold this idea of a very specific way of encountering color and experiencing color, right? So when we think about reclaiming color and what that means across the diaspora, we're thinking of materiality in the same way. Now we're reclaiming materiality. What does it mean for us to allow certain elements to come into our spaces that are truly a reflection, and how do we begin to actually establish that? So today we'll touch on materiality as a cultural language, reclaiming and innovating materials, and the future of Black materiality. And again, one place that we've been borrowing from, we touched on this in color theory, we touched on it in interior identity. For anyone who is here for the first time, all of the decks from the previous classes can also be found in Patreon as well if you want to go back for reference. But we have been borrowing from the Bauhaus movement and essentially using them as a case study. And Bauhaus had a clear design ethos, which is why we are using them as a case study for establishing our own interior style and design style. For their ethos, form follows function. Simplicity, craftsmanship meets industry. So today we're defining a cohesive design language for our diaspora, one that values history, craft, and innovation. Materiality is where it starts. So even when you go back to the image on the first page of the deck, if you look at that furniture piece, it has form, meaning you can essentially look at that piece and say, oh, this looks like art, right? It looks like it's a bench, but it looks like it could also be an art piece or something of that nature. So it has form and it also has function. You can sit on that piece and use it in your everyday life. So when we think about materiality and how it takes shape in our space, color naturally can intertwine in that it actually can be a huge part of the piece itself, looking at that furniture piece on page 1 in the deck, and then looking at how we actually introduce materials into our space. So, for thought starter, if Bauhaus was shaped by glass, steel, and geometry, what materials do we believe define the diasporic design movement? So, a previous image from last week's class, we saw how the colors took shape from the Bauhaus movement. They had a very clear color palette that they used across their movement that showed up in different ways. Let's think of this in the same way. How do we define material across the diasporic movement? Or what materials define? So I'm seeing faith rattan, page seagrass, wood cloth, earth, yes. Sending into LA, okay. Yes. Okay. When we look at what materials define, often we're pulling from history as a foundation, right? We're looking at it from the perspective of, based on what we know, these are the materials that we are going to lean into. So now that we understand that there's a place to pull from, right? These are kind of just like clay, yes, clay, wood, cotton. These are materials that are familiar to us, as stated above. So when we begin to look at this from the perspective of what materials define the diasporic movement, we essentially have to lean into what we know from history. And again, I think it's always looked a certain way when we look at materials and how they take shape in our space when it comes to the pieces that actually come from our culture. So now it's about moving that into a space that feels more modern to us, so that it actually feels. Yep. So I'm seeing y'all's answers come through, so that it actually feels like it is a part of us today as well. And I do think that that's been a huge gap. Is we have furniture, we have pieces that have been developed to reflect the culture, but often those feel like they carry a ton of history, and history is great, but how do we begin to translate that history into a modern day approach? Okay, I'm gonna move on to page 3 here. So, objective, explore how materials and textures that reflect the diaspora connect to history and identity. So we know that there are elements that do pull from history. Now it's about understanding how do we actually introduce those in a modern way. Okay, moving on to page 4. So, why materiality matters. When I talk about in the beginning that materiality is essentially the core of establishing some form of a design movement, it is the actual physical thing that we need to take up space and make an impact in a space. this first has to be a part of the conversation. Well, what does that look like? So when we think about the idea of materiality being an emotional trigger for us, when we think about the meaning of materiality in a space, we essentially are looking at this as a core foundation of what pieces can we identify today that actually resonate with us, and how do we begin to truly have access to all of those materials. Again, a stool is nice to have access to. A quilt is nice to have access to. These are pieces that often show up. But does that sofa reflect us? Does the coffee table reflect us? How do we begin to actually translate these pieces into larger pieces that are more impactful in a space? And let me know if y'all have any questions here as we move along. How do we balance authenticity and modernity in Black design? And I ask this question because most often when we think about the term modern, it does feel like it is being borrowed from a Eurocentric perspective. So what do we believe is a balance to establish authenticity when we introduce this form of modernity into design across the diaspora? And I'm going to allow some people to come in and chime in on this conversation here. So let me just see who is in the queue. Yes, you said yes, you Peppo Dreams, you want me to repeat the question. How do we balance authenticity and modernity in Black design? Meaning, if we are looking to establish a design style, how do we bring that to a more modern day form? And we're seeing a lot of designers do this in many ways through their work in some of the furniture pieces that are being built, but in a larger way, right? That reaches a majority of us. How do we balance authenticity and modernity in Black design? All right, Jen, I'm gonna let you in here. Hi, Jen, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you. How are you?
I'm well, how are you?
I'm doing well. I definitely thought about this, especially over the last week. And I think a lot of it has to do with decolonizing, the way we look at everything, which of course is kind of like, from what I understand, kind of the whole point of what you said, like about a lot of this,
Yeah.
I think of someone like Hannah Beachler. She was the production designer for Black Panther.
Yeah.
Looking into like an Afro-Futurism could be helpful, like a good guide to get there, and kind of look how someone like Hannah and how she truly like looked at and thought about what the progression would look like, in a futuristic African society.
Yeah.
And like, for me, that's really helpful as like a starting point. There is a level of like Eurocentric hold on what is considered modern.
Yeah.
And I think decolonizing it is really important, because we have to remember, like, there are going to be some things that look like the days of old, right?
Yeah.
But like that doesn't necessarily mean that it is not modern to us.
Yeah,
and so
exactly.
like looking at how that works is what I think, maybe one of the best ways we can do that.
Yeah, and I think that brings up such a valid point. And what Hannah did was she incorporated material that went beyond the aesthetic. And so often when we think about something that's modern, it is trying to fit into the aesthetic to which we've adopted from a mental perspective, right? It's what's being shown in front of us every single day that, does this relate to what feels the most modern today, which ultimately does drive back to a Eurocentric mindset. So that's such a valid point. I love that. Thank you so much, Jen.
Yeah, thank you.
Of course. All right, I'm gonna let one more. I think Ebony was in line here. Okay, we've got Ebony and Sia. I'm gonna let both in. So I'll let Ebony in first and then Sia next. Hi, Ebony.
How you doing? Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. So I think in my perspective, of course, when you look back at everything, and with just capitalism and imperialism, everything is kind of rooted with a white glaze over it.
Yeah.
But in when thinking about how to put a Black or African perspective on modern design, I always try to look back to the roots that made me the roots that have made me who I am.
Yeah.
So being a Black woman from the South, I think about like red clay, like constantly, like when you played, it stained your clothes.
Yeah.
Getting ready for church on Sunday, like the extravagant outfits, hats, and everything that you see.
Yeah.
And naming some of those small things, you're like, well, how can I incorporate that into design? Well, a lot of the colors that you see sometimes were worn, like the dark but still very bold colors, were so your outfits didn't get dirty all the time.
Exactly.
Or maybe certain hats and extravagant wear were to symbolize that people were coming into money that didn't sometimes have it. All of that to say that I feel if you look at the small things that made you who you were as you came up and where you grew as a Black person, as a person of color, you can integrate those things into your everyday life of living.
Yeah.
Like even another example I just thought of, like plastic being on the sofa in like the living room that nobody sat in.
Yeah.
It's like you see that kind of being done now with just plastic and acrylic chairs.
Yeah.
And I think that it's around us, but I think that it's hard for black folks and people of color to reclaim that narrative because we're never at the forefront.
Yeah.
But our influences are constantly around.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that is what I think about.
I love those. Those are such valid points, especially your example of the plastic kind of movement from the sofa, and now it's coffee tables and accent chairs. The transfer of that, what we saw is kind of normal, right? That was in most of our households growing up, and now it is sold at CB2. Right now that acrylic chair is sold at. So to us, we've abandoned what was once kind of a natural piece of our culture because it went with the time essentially, but we didn't necessarily reclaim that along the way. So someone else was able to someone else, as in the Eurocentric bubble, was able to kind of swoop in and reimagine what that looks like for a larger society. So now it's been stripped away from us in a way. It doesn't mean we can't go back and reclaim it, but it's been stripped away from us and the meaning that it had. I love that example. That is solid.
Right, exactly. And just to bounce off of you again, and I'm just coming up with these ideas off the top of my head. I just got out of my workout. Sorry, I'm all jittery. So it's just, of course, I can only say my perspective from being a Black woman that was born and raised in the South, but you constantly, it was always this underlying of tone policing for Black folks. So when you look at modern design or any type of design, like when we go back to this example of plastic on the sofa, you would see bold colors, intricate design up under that plastic, and you are not allowed to sit on it. But I find it really interesting that when you transition into like more modern minimalist, there you have these acrylic pieces, but there is no color, no texture under these pieces. There's always tone policing happening, even when it comes to the way that we think creatively. And I think that as Black folks, how we reclaim this is, you don't have to adopt what you see constantly being put in front of you, but rather question it. Like, why is everything so plain? Why is nothing loud? Because it seems like once Black people are allowed access to be loud and to be bold, whether it's with color, texture, print, we're always being told to tone down, to be more clean and refined, when in reality what we do is just refined in its essence because it's us. Because like if you have like a Caribbean background, your art is going to look way different from somebody who maybe grew up, I don't know, like in Haiti or Australia, but it might still be bold, but it's just going to look different. So I just think that, of course, we always have to go back and say that, imperialism and all that is why why we have a white glaze, but
Yes.
let's not focus on the white glaze. Focus on the
Yep.
roots that
Yep.
you know and what makes you happy when you look at it.
Certainly, and
Thank you for your time.
No, Ebony, this is spot on, and I think that's why it's so important for us to truly come to a place where we've established our own design style. We have to learn to borrow from us because we have all the pieces. We have the history. We have we have it all. We are the root of it. So once we truly understand what it means to begin to piece this together for ourselves, I believe we'll make the direction in, again, not only reclaiming, but as we move forward and we see future generations, instead of straying away from what seems natural in our environment, we start to reimagine what it looks like as we progress forward. So I love this, Ebony, and I appreciate your adrenaline. I'm loving the adrenaline.
I'm sorry, I'm sorry, yeah, it's just, I'm really passionate about like creativity and stuff like that. And I just hate that constantly we're always talking about how white-centered. I know that it has to be a conversation first and foremost. It has to be. But I just want us to lean in and start just questioning why everything constantly has to be so minimal and plain. And it's just subconscious tone policing of your creativity and mind. And when you feel like you have to tone down your creativity, it's kind of like toning down you and who you are. Because the bottom line is my idea of color and being bold may not be yours, but if we take a suburban like white person who kind of is like two generations of being middle class, like the dynamics are going to look totally different. And I don't think that it has to be a good or a bad, but it just has to be a difference that's placed there. And I don't want to constantly view my idea of creativity as being for or against theirs. It's just truly different.
You're right.
Thank you so much, Shane.
Yes, this was a pleasure. Thank you, Ebony. All right, Sia, I'm going to let you in here. Hi, Sia. Hi, Sia. It's hard to hear you. I think we're getting a little bit of wind. Can
you hear me?
A little bit. It's still a bit hard to hear. Yeah, Paige, she said Jamaica's in the house. All right, Sia, I'm going to disconnect here because we're not able to hear you.
Okay, bye.
Okay, we can try again if you want. Oh, okay. Maybe she'll try to come back in, but no, we weren't able to hear her. Okay, those were all valid points, and I do believe that there is a regrounding, similar to going back to Ebony's point. There's a regrounding and understanding that yes, there is this, there's a sense in society that has been set that we haven't necessarily challenged from a design perspective in a large way. Not to say that it's not being done in a micro way or in a local way, but there's a sense that we are establishing our design style, right? We are leaning into it as we sit here in class to come to some form of an agreement as to how we begin to really take space and shape our spaces that reflect us. So moving right along, if y'all have any questions, please drop them in the chat. So when we think about colonial disruption and material innovation, colonization erased regional materials in favor of mass production. So a lot of what we had as a culture was erased, and it has been erased. It's been erased for us, and it's been erased for other cultures. However, for us, we still have access to reintroduce those back into our society. So now it's about truly understanding what that looks like and how to achieve it. We've seen the Ashanti stool, Adinkra symbols on textiles and across branding. We've seen these show up. So now it's about how does it continue to take space and take up shape, or take shape and take up space. The future of Black materiality. We've seen, and someone just mentioned this previously, I believe it was Jen, we've seen Afro-Futurism, especially across films like Black Panther. We've seen Afro-Futurism show up for us in different ways across film, in some design spaces, in some furniture pieces. We've seen this be a form of a movement for us in the way to which we are defining the future of the arts that to which we exist in. Also, there's a sense of sustainability. So that is naturally rooted in a lot of our materials. Again, when you drop a list here of the materials that feel the most familiar to us as a culture, a lot of those have been sustained throughout history. So they aren't mass produced and they aren't easily accessible. It doesn't mean that we can't borrow inspiration and begin to create our own pieces from it, but for the majority, the true form of them has been sustained. So key shifts in materiality. So we're seeing earth building, reconnecting with traditional techniques. Recycled materials are merging history and sustainability. 3D printed decor, merging with technology and craft. This is the way that we're seeing it kind of take shape today, and that's becoming the future based on the idea of Afro-Futurism. And then it's taking from that idea, yes, we're moving forward in many ways across the areas to which I've just mentioned, but also borrowing from what has essentially kind of existed for us throughout history in our materials. Color and innovation, we're seeing movement in that space. So what once was kind of bright and bold for us and slowly over time became more minimal and muted, we're seeing that be reintroduced into society. We're showing up in ways that are bright and bold. Our pieces are starting to reflect us again. We're intermixing the idea of, okay, if this is what's been pushed on us from a design perspective in a minimal way, how do I reintroduce elements that are reflective of me? We're seeing these practices kind of kick into gear. Now it's truly understanding what materiality looks like as we think about the next 5 to 20 years. What does that look like, and how do we begin to imagine it for ourselves in a very literal way? Bauhaus embraced technology without losing its philosophy. Again, from a case study perspective, from a movement perspective, it was embraced that these certain elements of technology emerging, understanding that history had to be intertwined, connecting with those or reconnecting with those traditional techniques. Bauhaus understood that there would be a force that would kind of move it forward to be in a modern form, but it didn't lose its philosophy. And that's what we have to be mindful of in this journey of establishing that interior identity. So where does Afro-Futurism fit into a movement, and how does that begin to take shape for us? I will allow someone in. I've got Nikki here that's waiting, so I'm going to allow Nikki in. So where does Afro-Futurism fit into our design movement? Hi, Nikki.
Hello.
How are you?
I'm great, thanks. I'm new to your channel, and I'm all the way in the British Virgin Islands.
Oh, wonderful. Bring us all with you.
Yes. So, I know you already passed this topic, but I wanted to talk about the colonial identity here that is still, present in the Caribbean, especially in the British Virgin Islands.
Yes.
Especially when it comes to our architecture, our design, even down to, the way we present our cuisines. It's still very much a struggle to get away from that. And as someone who works with a local fashion designer, it's been really an eye-opening moment for me to look at, how we as a community and how we as, Black West Indians could step out of, the colonial identity, and how we could, be more confident in our Black history, and how we could trace our ancestry back to Africa, and to see how, the Caribbean and Africa has such a close connection in architecture and fashion, in the way that we dance, even to our cultural wear. It was so surprising for me going down a rabbit hole, seeing that, my dad is from Dominica, that's the other Caribbean island.
Yes.
And to see how similar the national wear is to, clothes in Nigeria and Ghana. It was very surprising. So finding your channel to me was just like a sign that I should pay more attention to what's going on around me and in the Caribbean fashion-wise. So I just wanted to say thank you.
Yes, of course, of course.
It's really, really, really beautiful.
Of
Absolutely
course.
beautiful.
Yes, of course, and thank you for chiming into the conversation and sharing your experience. I think we're all kind of sharing the same common goal here, right? Which is to reestablish our identity in our spaces, very literally.
Yes. So thank you so
Of
much. Have a
course.
wonderful day.
Of
Bye.
course. Bye, Nikki. Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right, we've got AJ and Ebony. All right, I'm going to let AJ in. They were next, and then Ebony, you're next. Paige said, get it right. Dominica, not DR. We heard you. Okay, Ebony, you're next. AJ, I think they disconnected. We're working off of Ebony's adrenaline right now, y'all. We're going to keep leaning into it. Hi, Ebony.
Okay, I'm sorry.
No, why are you apologizing? Don't apologize.
Can you can you repeat the question again, please? I'm sorry, like I was moving around in the house. So you said how can we incorporate Afro-Futurism into today's design?
It's more or less, where does Afro-Futurism fit into a design movement as we look at design across the diaspora, right? So we had, I believe, was it you, Ebony, or was it Ken who mentioned the Black Panther film?
I think it was Ken.
Okay, Ken mentioned it. So when we think about,
Mentioned that.
yeah, when we think about Black Panther, right, it had very Afro-futuristic design throughout, from the attire to the way to which the world was being imagined, like very Afro-futurist, which is beautiful. But how does that take shape, or does it take shape in physical form inside of a space?
I think it absolutely does. I think that one thing that, once again, going back to my roots, I think that a lot of people can relate to this. You will all go over to grandma's house sometimes, like all of the cousins, and y'all would make your pallets on the floor, and you would go to sleep, stay up all night. But also, this would be where you play games. This will be where you dance. This will
Yes.
be where you fellowship with your people.
Yes.
So then I think that, okay, like, let's take this same concept and see where it's already been done in design. When probably, I think maybe like in the 70s, like 80s designs, where you would have these big pits of like conversation areas in people's homes.
Yeah.
Like where it would be sunken in, and these people would be like, doing all of the things that you weren't supposed to do, but having fun, partying all night.
Yeah.
But also maybe even dancing. These are things that I feel like Black people have always been doing. But like, what if these areas were able to like kind of transform from somewhere to dance, from somewhere to rest at night, or just things that people, Black people value, like our hair and the tools that we use for our hair and all of this being able to be incorporated into design that works for us.
Yeah, for sure.
Like naturally having things that maybe like functionality. I'm just thinking, like when it comes to hair tools, like certain things that we use to braid, we use to wash, we use to all of this, how can it be put into a modernist perspective that would work for Black people? I'm not saying that I have that answer, but it's just that I think our references of what we enjoy to do as Black, function, I'm looking at the comments too. I think that I think incorporating things that Black people desire to function in everyday life can be to Afro-Futurism. So I like to use an example because it keeps me on track. But like the conversation pit. Yeah. Like a conversation pit that can also turn into a dance floor, but back into an area to maybe rest.
Certainly.
Because in other countries they party all night. But think if you really had like this really cool place that like turned into a dance floor, but like at a certain period of time it becomes a place of rest. Like that could be considered Afro-Futurism to us.
Yeah, and
so that's oh, sorry.
No, go ahead, please.
Oh, no, I was done. I was just rambling.
I was going to add, and that's where when you look at the case study of Bauhaus, the Bauhaus movement succeeded because it was clear, functional, and intentional. And I believe that when we look at a design style, the goal is to ensure that it hits on those 3 points. It's clear, it's functional, and it's intentional. So that goes back to your idea of the conversation pit, right? It was very clear what it was. It was extremely functional, right? You could sit, you could lay, you could be, right? And it was intentional. It had a very clear message behind what it was trying to achieve. So that's from a cohesive perspective. When we think about how we define a cohesive diasporic design movement, we have to do it with the same clarity.
Right.
Yes, I love that. I love
think
that.
That's very true. Yeah, but I think that's all that I have on that subject as of right now. Thank you so much.
Of course, Ebony. And Ken, it's Jen. I said Ken. Ebony, we have to correct ourselves. It's Jen.
Oh, sorry. Jen, my bad.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Sorry about that. Sorry, Jen. Okay. And that brings us to a conclusion for ourselves today in the space of materiality. We understand what it is, right? There's not a disconnect or gap there. We understand exactly what I mean when I say materiality. We understand that it exists in certain forms at the current moment. But it's a powerful expression of identity and cultural history. So understanding how we begin to reclaim materiality in our spaces, what that looks like. We researched in the homework this week, for those of you who did it, we researched what pieces currently are pull us, right? What pieces we currently resonate with that are done and work of someone of African descent and reflective of us as a culture and holds that level of symbolism from a peace perspective. So in the continued work, we identify that work is being done very literally, right? There are artists out there who are crafting and releasing and launching pieces. The work is being done, and now it's about understanding how we begin to truly lean into that and either take up space and be a part of doing the work, or take up space by acquiring and consuming the work and truly leaning into what is reflective of us as a culture. So that brings me to the end of my point. I will allow any other guests in who want to chime in. Jen is back, so yes, Jen is absolutely coming in here. Hi, Jen. I'm so sorry.
Oh no, honestly, it just made me laugh. It's like, oh, that's funny. Again, I wanted to come up because Paige and I were kind of chatting a little in the comments, and something that I think is really important. I actually was talking to someone about this a few weeks ago, and talking about how a Eurocentric view on things is very individualized. And I made the comment to her about how we're extremely dangerous when we gather, and pretty much all systems crumble to pieces. You know, when we decide to gather and become community. And I do think that our communities and our, even just throughout the diaspora, have done a pretty good job of keeping some idea of community, really,
Yeah.
like we joke about, if you see someone running, we'll all run.
Yeah, exactly, exactly.
Different things like that. But whenever we are thinking about this, I do think it's really important to think about almost unity or utopia in mind when we design these spaces, which, if we design with that mindset, and the mindset of the people who came before us, 500 years ago, and what they were doing, there really is and was something really important about what's yours is mine. And, I don't design just for me, I design for you.
Yeah.
And what that looks like. And I do think honing in on that is really important. And I appreciate what she was saying about,
Certainly.
About our design side of styles and what that looks like. And we were just kind of building up on that in the comments a little bit. And I think that's important.
Yeah, that's very important, and you make a very strong point, which is something that I believe, as I was seeing in the comments, something that we all resonate with, which is when we come together as a collective and understand how much power we truly have to establish the things within society that we need to establish for ourselves to move our culture forward. It truly is a force to be reckoned with. So I love that acknowledgement, and also the call out, which is, again, it's a powerful stance here today. Our goal as a collective, I believe, is we're learning, right? I can tell you as much as I humanly can about interiors and design and things of that nature, because that's my work and it's my craft. However, I understand that there's a gap, and I know that in order to close that gap, we have to do it as a collective. It has to be a group effort.
Absolutely.
I love that.
And the whole reason I got into design in the first place, kind of how other people saw us,
Yeah.
from, I think I was 9, and I just, it really hit me And I'm like, I want to fix how that is, and I want to fix how we interact
Yeah.
with spaces.
Appreciate the insight on this, on your thought process and your creative journey to get to the place that you did. But understanding where you borrowed from is always so important to me, which is a huge part of why we're having this course, right? It's where are we borrowing from constantly. All right, well, thank you so much, Jen. I'm going to let Paige and then Black Peppa and then Ebony, you're in next. I'm just going in line here. Hi, Paige.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Awesome. So when I was thinking about this question and thinking about what Afro-Futurism would physically, literally look like, I realized the reason I was coming up short, because I was even trying to find images of it. And when you look up images, it immediately resorts to like shiny, ultra kind of like weird cylindrical or very round shapes, like silvers and oranges, like all these really shallow interpretations of what it means to be in the future.
Yeah.
And so I realized oftentimes the difficulty, at least for me, in thinking about Afro-Futurism as it relates to interior design is because it requires us to reimagine a different world completely from the ground up.
Yeah.
And it made me to think about who are we when we're not who the world told us to be?
Yeah.
Or who are we when we're not reflecting what the world told us to feel? So if you want to feel luxe, what immediately comes to mind? Oftentimes you see people with a lot of white or maybe like Chanel signs or whatever.
Yeah.
Why does that relate to being luxe as opposed to something that connects more to us as a people? And like really starting to examine and question that. And I started to think about then, how has Eurocentrism shaped each of our identities? Like even in the smallest ways, from the foods we eat, as an example. If you eat a very Eurocentric diet, you're probably going to have a lot of like charcuterie, a lot of like cheeses, a lot of those sorts of things.
Yeah.
If you eat a more like, say, Caribbean diet, doesn't matter what time of year, we're going to eat hot soup always.
Yeah.
So if you're eating a diet that's more reflective of your people, that will inform, for instance, the dishware that you purchase, and that will inform the material that the dishware is made out of.
Yeah.
If you are centering, I was thinking about like all these new developments that are being built in West Africa, and how honestly, and this is going to sound probably a little bit controversial or ignorant, non-African they feel. Like it feels like these could be homes in just literally any country, any city, anywhere.
Yep.
And I realized the reason why is because they're emulating what they've seen in America. They're emulating what the demand is for. But those homes don't center us. They don't center community. They don't center us meeting together. They don't center the things that are indicative of Blackness wherever it is found on earth. And those things are community. Those things are gathering. Those things are warmth. Those homes are built for separation. And that separation is a traditionally very white thing.
Yeah.
Everybody off their own corner in the house without ever really coming together. Guests not coming over. Guests certainly not being welcome to stay, not feeling welcome to stay. Those are very traditionally white ways of being, very British ways of being.
Yes.
Our Blackness is the exact opposite of that. So I've been thinking about, when you ask that question, Afro-Futurism as it relates to materiality and the function that it would serve in one's life, that tying a form and function, and then questioning what functions are actually integral to my culture, to me as a person, and to what speaks to not only the way I live my life, but the way that my community lives our lives. So those are all the things I was thinking.
And I love that page. Two things to comment on. The first is you mentioned that when you pulled up Afrofuturism, it looked a very specific way, which didn't feel, I'm assuming it didn't really hit your palate.
No.
I'm curious who created those images that you're looking at, right? Just putting it out there. I always have to pose the question, who's the creator behind those images? And then secondly, when we think about where we've come to as a culture across every lane, there was a young woman who came into the chat during the first class, and she mentioned that we can't disregard Southern Black design. And again, my intention is to never disregard anything. I believe we all have our own lived experiences, although it's shared. She mentioned we can't disregard it. It's not about disregarding, but it's about the understanding of where we are pulling from. So how did we arrive at a Black Southern design? Where did that come from? What's the history behind it? So, and that goes to your point, when you look at the developments that are being done in certain countries right now, I'm thinking of one specifically right now in Zanzibar, the large developments being done in Zanzibar. And when I look at that development, it is reflective of something that I would see in Miami. And
Exactly.
it's one, who's the target consumer for that product? Who are you trying to attract? And then what was the intention behind the development? So this goes back to the points that you were making. We're constantly borrowing from a design style. Jen just said it in her previous comment. We're constantly borrowing from design styles that are so far, and we're just pulling ourselves further away, so far away from us.
Exactly. And I think the more insidious part of that is that it starts to convince our people that that is what we should ascribe to, that is how we start to lose the ties to our culture, to our heritage, to our community, by emulating communities that were never ours.
Yeah.
Adopting mentalities, adopting even, things as small as like the materials that we're using or the things that we ascribe to.
Yeah.
When you constantly see it presented before you as like, this is what Lux is, this is what you should strive for, it further erodes away our connection to not only lands that we come from, but lands that we've never been or want to go back to.
Yeah.
And it erodes away the identity to push everyone in the direction of whiteness, of Eurocentrism. So
yes.
thank you for that question today.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing, Paige. And I'm gonna let Black Peppa in next.
Hello.
Hi, how are you?
I'm fine, thank you.
Of course.
In relation to Afro-Futurism and design, I totally agree with what the previous guests had to share. My mind straight away went to functionality. I'm Ugandan, so a lot of times we have a lot of proverbs that we rely on, and one of them is how everything that you use should be necessary, needs to be consumed. Like, for instance, if you meet people who are pastoralists, they will tell you that every part of the cow is useful. You have to use every single thing. Nothing should be wasted. So if we use that same concept in Afrofuturism, every element of your home should be functional. If you have a bench, maybe it could be used as storage. And I know some of these concepts have been used already. I think actually one of the things that is truly African is also food and how we share with our communities. But it's also, there's so much that we have to deconstruct. Our cultures have been demonized for so long.
Yes.
And I think we need to start seeing more creators and more designers who use African materials, Afrocentric materials, and our history to create beautiful spaces. And I also wanted to talk about how we source pieces. I mean, I live on the continent, but sometimes it's hard to find something that was made by an artisan that was either trained through a specific culture. It's hard to find those. Sometimes you will move around and find something and you look at the tag and it still says made in China. So that convenience, we haven't really tapped into.
Correct.
How convenient it is. And that's a lot of what I wanted to talk about.
That's spot on. Yes.
Thank you for this conversation.
Yes, thank you so much. It's such a pleasure.
Awesome.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Dreams. Thank you. Thank everybody who chimed into the conversation to help move us along. I look forward to our class next week. You can see on the last page that we'll be talking about Black spatial futures and the new design narrative. That will be our final class together. It doesn't mean it'll be our last time together forever, but it will be our last class next week. So I look forward to seeing y'all then. Thank you again.